This is a demo in acrylic paint, and I'm going to be painting this little doorway from Italy. And I'm using my canvases are going to be a little smaller for some of these demos, just so you can get up close and personal right here. Hello. And this, instead of a canvas, I'm using a watercolor board that I've pre-gessoed. And gesso is just an Italian word for chalk. It looks like white acrylic paint, but it's got a little bit more tooth to it, so your paint absorbs into it and also sticks to it better than if I was just to paint right on the board. So anytime you want to paint on anything, I'd always recommend gessoing it, even if it's already been gessoed, like most canvases are. So here's an example of a canvas board, like a canvas panel that's already been pre-gessoed. It's white, so we know it's been gessoed. It's got a weave of the canvas fabric, and that just gives you a little bit of texture when you're painting small. I've done another demo with that small canvas earlier, and you can see that texture of the canvas. This was an oil painting demo coming through. So depending on what surface you want to paint on, you're going to get some of that texture or no texture at all, depending on what you're painting on, coming through. Now with acrylic paint, I like to do something called dry brushing, and I'm going to show that to you in a bit. So I need some texture, just a tiny bit. So when I was gessoing this piece of paper that's affixed to a board automatically, the paper already had a little bit of texture to it, but when I was painting the gesso on, I painted it on a little thicker. And I know you can't see it in this video, but there's a tiny bit of texture from my brush where I painted that gesso on. Gesso is pronounced as it sounded, gesso. It's spelled G-E-S-S-O. I'm using M. Graham acrylics. They are my favorite acrylic paint, but Golden is a great brand as well. Liquitex would be one of my lesser appreciated brands, but it's also just fine. I would recommend you always steer clear of those student grade paints. When you're learning to paint, we don't really want to spend too much money on our paints, so we tend to try and save some costs on the paint. But the paint itself, these 5 colors I can do almost anything with. There are some exceptions, but for the most part, these 5 colors that I've put in my supply list, I can do almost anything with. So if I have them in a good quality paint, M. Graham or Golden, or if I have to, Liquitex Professional, then I can create all kinds of effects. But if I buy a student grade paint, they're going to be a little bit watered down, so they have more binder than pigment, and the color won't be as vibrant or as opaque, and therefore I'll need a lot more paint to be able to create the same effects that I would with this good quality paint. Next, I'm using a paper palette here to mix my paints on, and I have a palette knife. And I'm going to show you how to mix your paints with a palette knife in a bit here. I have a bucket of water and my brushes. I want a bigger brush just for spreading down the paint, big washes of color. And this big brush can be really anything. Now on my supply list, I had mentioned a big flat brush about 1 inch wide. If I give you sizes, that's tricky because every manufacturer will size things slightly different. So a 6 filbert by Royal Langnickel might not be the same size as a comparable brush from Connoisseur or Princeton. So there's no real standard. So rather than putting like a size on it, I just said get one that's roughly about 1 inch wide. And I'm working pretty small, so my brushes might be scaled smaller. So you might want to work bigger. The bigger your canvas is, the bigger you should scale your brushes up. I've got a mid-sized filbert, and a filbert brush, by the way, is just a brush that is a little bit rounded on the end, but has a wide edge and a thin edge. So you'll see that when you turn it to its side, it has a wide edge or a thin edge. It's been squished here at the ferrule or ferrule. That's where the bristles are stuck inside and glued together. So I have 2. Whether that large brush is a flat or a filbert doesn't really matter. It's just for laying in big colors. For the middle-sized brush, I like a filbert because it's good for the dry brushing techniques I'll be doing a little later with you. Then I have a detail brush, and that's just a round brush that makes a good point. So this is one you might have to replace more often. But again, not too tiny. I'm not buying a size 00. Just something that's going to allow me to actually hold paint inside of it, but also make some smaller marks. My palette knife here, I like ones that have a bit of a diamond shape and that come down. So it comes down and across. it's not just straight out, because this is easier for me to make color mixes, and I always use the bottom edge for color mixes, and I get better pools of color.